In the spring of the 32 BC year, Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius journeyed from Alexandria to Ephesus in order to rendezvous with Rome's fleeing Senate. Over 200 senators had abandoned Rome on the coattails of Gaius Sosius and Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus, the consuls who spearheaded the exodus, joining them in their opposition to Caesar Divi Filius following his threats against them at the beginning of their consular terms in January of 32 BC. By a bold and shameless move in which he appropriated the last will and testament of Marcus Antonius from the house of the Vestals, carefully examining its contents before reading select passages to the Senate, Caesar had succeeded in convincing the people of Rome, who would not abide another civil war between Roman generals, that Marcus Antonius fully intended to make Alexandria the new capital of the Roman Empire. Caesar Divi Filius had finally managed to garner support for the war he so desperately wanted. A war not against Marcus Antonius, whose official status as triumvir had expired with the close of the 33 BC year, but rather a war against Cleopatra, a foreign queen guilty of bankrolling the military agenda of her Roman lover, who was now only a private citizen. Around this same time, Cleopatra persuaded Antonius to officially divorce Caesar's sister, Octavia Verina, and to formally wed her in accordance with Egyptian custom. Despite the fact that marriages between Roman citizens and foreigners were not recognized under Roman law, Marcus Antonius dispatched messengers to his mansion in Athens. There they presented his Roman wife with a bill of divorce before ejecting her from his property, tossing Octavia and the children out onto the streets of Athens. Gathering up her own children, as well as her stepson Iulus Antonius, Octavia fled back to Rome and into the awaiting arms of her brother, who amplified her plight as further proof that Marcus Antonius had forsaken his Romanness at the altar of the evil temptress, Cleopatra. With war between them now inevitable, Antonius gathered his forces and summoned his allies. King Amyntas of Galatia, King Tarquindimotus of Cilicia, King Archelaus of Cappadocia, and others were called to arms, expected to march to war against Caesar Divi Filius alongside Marcus Antonius. Even King Herod sent legions to support Antonius, although he was unable to travel to Greece at the time, as a devastating earthquake in Judea demanded his presence at home. Withdrawing his legions from the east, Antonius began the meticulous process of transporting them across the sea, where he expected to face Caesar Divi Filius across a battlefield somewhere in Greece. In order to maintain open supply lines so that he could keep his army fed while on the march, Antonius sent various allies to secure vital trading routes. Marcus Antonius placed Bogud, the king of West Mauritania who had been exiled by his brother, East Mauritania's King Bocchus, in the naval port town of Mithon, on the west side of the Peloponnesus. It is recorded that Antonius also secured the towns of Corinth, Patrae, and Leucas with allies who remain unnamed by historical sources. With his supply lines now defended, Antonius began the discreet operation of transporting his many legions into the Ambracian Gulf. This inland body of water, which was protected by a narrow waterway called the Straits of Actium, was not visible from the Adriatic Sea, allowing Antonius to disembark his incoming legions for distribution around the Gulf. As his ships continued to arrive, Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra, who wisely kept Egypt's war chest in her possession, wintered at the town of Patrae. But Marcus Antonius, the product of a bygone era of warfare in which greater numbers usually won the day, had not been paying attention to the multifaceted ways in which warfare had evolved over the previous decade. Not only had superior numbers been of no help to him in Media Atropatene, but neither had Caesar's victories against Sextus Pompeius, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and against Illyricum been achieved through overwhelming numbers, but through strategy, multi-pronged battle plans conceived by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. As Marcus Antonius sat in Patrae, confidently allowing his legions to pour into the Ambracian Gulf, Marcus Agrippa had stationed lookouts around Greece and the Peloponnesus, recording the comings and goings of the shipping traffic. By the time the lion's share of Antonius' more than 23 legions had been ferried into the Ambracian Gulf, Marcus Agrippa knew where he was and had some idea of his intended strategy. With Antonius's forces bottled up in the Gulf, which had limited natural access to fresh water, Agrippa led a surprise attack against the town of Methone. King Bogud of Mauritania was killed in the battle that saw Methone come under the control of Marcus Agrippa. After Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra moved from Patrae to the town of Actium in the spring of 31 BC, Marcus Agrippa took Patrae and also moved against the towns of Leucas and Corinth. With the trading towns necessary to Antonius's survival now under the control of Marcus Agrippa, Caesar Divi Filius sailed from Italy, positioning his fleet at the entrance to the Straits of Actium by midsummer of 31 BC. Marcus Antonius, Cleopatra, half the Roman Senate, and all of Antonius' legions were now trapped in the Ambracian Gulf, cut off from incoming supplies and fresh water. Realizing he had gotten himself trapped, Marcus Antonius made an immediate attempt to break out. Under the joint naval commands of Gaius Sosius and Cilicia's king Tarquin Demotus, he launched an attack against Lucius Arruntius, the naval commander who upheld Caesar's left flank. The attack was successful, and Lucius Arruntius was forced to flee. However, a fleet under the command of Marcus Agrippa, at the close of their mission to deprive Antonius of his supply towns, returned at this same time. King Tarquin Demotus died during the alternate sea battle, and Gaius Sosius was forced to withdraw back to the safety of the Straits of Actium. Over the next 4 to 6 weeks, a standoff ensued. Although small skirmishes took place on land and sea between the forces of Marcus Antonius and those of Caesar Divi Filius, neither side launched a full-blown attack. Caesar, who had set up his headquarters in the nearby town of Merklitz, hoped to reduce the loss of Roman life by employing the Fabian strategy of starving his opponent into submission. An attack against Antonius did not assure victory for Caesar Divi Filius. By the same token, Marcus Antonius, with approximately 170 Roman ships and 60 Egyptian vessels, was slightly outnumbered by Caesar's 230 beaked ships and 30 ships without beaks. Despite his ships being larger and better equipped, which compensated for their inferior numbers, neither could Antonius be assured of victory, and so both sides waited. As the weeks passed, the strain on Antonius' men began to take its toll. What fresh supplies Antonius could procure were taking much longer to arrive, as they had to travel via a long and circuitous land route in order to safely reach him. And with his supply of fresh water cut off, malaria soon ran roughshod over his legions, striking men down in droves. As Antonius' ships began to rot in the Gulf, so did the loyalty of his supporters. Following the death of their father, King Tarquin Demotus of Cilicia, Philopater and Laos abandoned Antonius and Cleopatra. Taking with them the Cilician legions which had been supplied to Antonius by their late father, the sons instead pledged them to the cause of Caesar Divi Filius. Even King Amyntas, whom Antonius had placed on the throne of Galatia, abandoned Antonius and Cleopatra. According to the poet Horace, 2,000 Galatians turned their noses towards Antonius and Cleopatra, chanting Caesar's name. Near the end of August, with so many deaths and defections that Marcus Antonius could no longer man all his ships, and with many of his legions now positioned around the Ambracian Gulf, Antonius and Cleopatra called a war council. It was time to make a decision. Their forces could not survive a winter trapped within the Gulf. If they did not act now, their defeat was assured. Publius Canidius Crassus, the legate Antonius had tasked with forcing peace onto the kings of Iberia and Albania just prior to Antonius's Media Atropatene campaign, argued that it was time to send Cleopatra home. On land, Caesar Divi Filius did not stand a chance against Marcus Antonius, whose veteran legions were superior. But on the sea, the advantage clearly belonged to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. He suggested Antonius abandon his fleet, combine what was left of his men and those brought by Egypt's queen with the legions Antonius had positioned around the Gulf, and then march his army into either Thrace or Macedonia, thereby forcing Caesar to abort his confrontation on the sea. But Cleopatra, whose primary concern was the safety of Egypt and the security of her war chest, disagreed. By walking away from their fleet, Egypt became vulnerable should Caesar not take the bait and choose instead to turn his ships towards Alexandria. Furthermore, her war chest, which she knew Caesar needed to pay his legions, and those legions defecting to him, was safer aboard her flagship, called the Antonius, than it would be on land. Cleopatra suggested instead that they break out of Actium, that they force a battle during which she and Marcus Antonius might escape to Alexandria, and that there they could regroup, then draw Caesar into a land battle on their own terms. Following this war council, Marcus Antonius began making preparations for a naval engagement. He burned all of the ships which he could not man and pressed all the men he had left onto the remaining ships, making sure each vessel was full. In addition to packing his ships full of legions, weapons, armor, and other military equipment, sails were loaded onto the vessels, not standard equipment for a naval battle. Whether Marcus Antonius meant only to escape from the Bay of Actium, or hoped to win the engagement while simultaneously allowing for the contingency of escape should things not go his way, is still debated by historians to this day. But it seems clear that some of the men involved within this war council saw the actions of Marcus Antonius as capitulation to the selfish demands of Cleopatra, who was obviously planning to save herself at the expense of Rome's legions. Not only did Quintus Dellius, a longtime supporter of Antonius and Cleopatra, defect after this meeting, but so too did Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus, the naval commander whose son was betrothed to Antonius's eldest daughter by Octavia. We are told that Aenobarbus, who was ill with fever, having possibly contracted malaria, left the camp of Marcus Antonius in the middle of the night. Rowing across the bay in a small boat, Aenobarbus surrendered to Caesar Divi Filius and brought with him the very battle plans which had been drawn up by Marcus Antonius during the war council. When Antonius discovered the defection of Aenobarbus, he graciously forwarded to him all his private belongings as well as his staff and advisers. But Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus, whom Suetonius called the best of his family, died of his illness only a few days after defecting. We are told that Caesar Divi Filius, after learning of Antonius' intentions, suggested to Marcus Agrippa that they allow Antonius and Cleopatra to escape. This would give them time before winter to secure the region around Greece, and then they could deal with the lovers in the spring. But Marcus Agrippa disagreed. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra had to be dealt with now. By waiting, he argued, there were too many variables left unchecked which might see the pair's circumstances greatly improved. Knowing that Marcus Agrippa was a tactical genius, Caesar acquiesced. The battle would take place before winter. On the morning of September 2nd of the 31 BC year, Marcus Antonius sailed his fleet out through the Straits of Actium. Positioning his ships along the coastline where the water was more shallow, Antonius hoped to prevent Caesar's fleet from attempting to circle around his sides and flank him. Antonius commanded from his right, alongside Lucius Gellius Poplicola. His left was commanded by Quintus Collius Acciacus, and his centre by Marcus Octavius and Marcus Instaeus. Cleopatra, commanding from her flagship, the Antonius, remained behind at the head of approximately 60 to 90 ships packed with legions. Caesar Divi Filius commanded from his right flank, with Marcus Agrippa on the left, and Lucius Arruntius at the centre. For the majority of the morning, both sides faced one another with neither fleet moving to engage. Then, around midday, as the winds began to pick up, Marcus Antonius advanced his line forward in an attempt to entice Caesar. But Marcus Agrippa did not take the bait. Instead, Agrippa ordered half the fleet to back away, doubling the thickness of Caesar's naval formation. Then Marcus Agrippa moved to attack the right wing of Marcus Antonius. Poplicola responded by moving his line to prevent the right from being flanked. However, in maneuvering against Agrippa, Poplicola separated from the center, throwing it into chaos. The ships of both sides then converged on one another and battle ensued. We are told that the fighting was fierce and went on for hours as ships were rammed, sunk, and boarded by men from both sides. At last, taking advantage of a gap that had opened between the combatants, Cleopatra, with approximately 60 to 90 ships in tow, launched. Fighting her way forward, Cleopatra and her fleet finally punched through the chaos and headed for open waters. Once beyond the battle, she raised her sails and made for the open sea. Although we are told that Marcus Antonius did not initially believe Cleopatra had fled the battle while the outcome was still undecided, and believed her flight to be the result of a hasty decision made by a fleet commander, he nonetheless transferred to a faster vessel, which he used to pursue and then board the Antonius. As Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra sailed away in the company of ships packed with legions, what would be called the Battle of Actium raged on. Men fought and died for a commander and queen who were no longer present as their ships sunk to the bottom of the sea. Caesar Divi Filius and Marcus Agrippa shouted in vain to their enemies that Antonius, their commander, was long gone, the fight was over, and that they should save themselves by surrendering. But Antonius' men would not stop fighting, forcing Caesar and Agrippa to employ fire tactics. They had chosen not to use flaming arrows earlier in the battle, as Caesar did not want to risk setting Cleopatra's war chest ablaze. But with that significant war chest now making its way back to Alexandria, fire was needed to bring the battle to its close. We are told that after many ships were burned and many men drowned, the Battle of Actium ended around the 10th hour. Yet, fighting still continued throughout the night in some areas. That night, even after the bulk of Antonius' abandoned men had surrendered, Caesar Divi Filius slept aboard his flagship, hesitating to return to his headquarters, where he might be ambushed by those legions Antonius had stationed around the Ambracian Gulf. 3 days later, the land legions and cavalry, which Antonius had posted about the Ambracian Gulf, surrendered to Caesar Divi Filius and were incorporated into his legions. Their commander, Publius Cneidius Crassus, also fled to rejoin Antonius and Cleopatra in Alexandria. After all the legions succumbed, Caesar wanted to immediately pursue Antonius and Cleopatra, but many of his own legions, some who could trace their military service back some 20 years to the campaigns of Julius Caesar, were tired. They longed to conclude their military terms and return to private life. And so Caesar was forced to remain in the area of Actium for the 31 to 30 BC winter, where he oversaw the discharging of approximately 10 of his veteran legions. Although we don't know which lands were specifically granted to these men for their retirements, we do know that it would not have been difficult for Caesar Divi Filius to win the Senate's approval for the settling of his veterans. Upon leaving Italy to begin his military campaign against Cleopatra, Caesar Divi Filius forced every senator who had not fled Rome following the Senate's split into active military duty within his campaign. Much like Antonius calling his allies to war, Caesar allowed no senators to remain in Rome where they might conspire to bring him down in his absence. Between the half of the Senate that accompanied Caesar to Greece and those who had defected from Marcus Antonius, he had sufficient numbers to form a majority, and so 10 of his legions were allowed to retire. After wintering near Actium, Caesar set out to pursue Cleopatra and Antonius. However, rather than sailing for Egypt, the revised plan was to march to Alexandria through Anatolia and Syria. By taking this route, Caesar meant to reach Antonius' client kings before they could be regrouped into a new army for Antonius and Cleopatra. With his beefed-up army, which had gained over 20 new legions as the outcome of the Battle of Actium, despite the retiring of 10 legions, Caesar Divi Filius set off for Asia Minor. It was high time for the capture and surrender of Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra, and an end to Rome's civil wars.